There is a particular kind of woman that a small town never quite knows what to do with, sharp enough to see through the arrangements other people accept without question, honest enough to say so plainly, and patient enough to have survived a long string of men who mistook those qualities for deficiencies. I have known a few such women over the course of my life. The story I want to tell you today is about one of them, and about the man who was finally wise enough to listen the entire accounting before he formed a single opinion of his own. Willa Thorn could tell you the name of every man in Harwick County who had courted her and then thought better of it. She could tell you the name, the reason given, and the approximate season in which the courtship had ended, with the same precision she brought to measuring tinctures in her mother's dispensary. And on a Thursday afternoon in the fall of 1882, she found herself reciting that list, without being asked, without apology, and without any particular embarrassment, to a cattle rancher named Declan Rourke, who had just offered to walk her back to the clinic from Abner's Supply Depot on the east end of Harwick's main road. She said, "Before you walk anywhere with me, Mr. Rourke, I think it is only fair to tell you that there are 7 men in this county who have tried exactly that and reconsidered before long. I would rather give you the accounting myself than have you hear it secondhand from someone who will enjoy the telling more than you will enjoy the hearing." Clifford Pace said, "I talked about medicine too freely for a farmer's wife." Barnaby Wren said, "No reasonable man wants a wife who can name his ailments before the doctor does." Lester Quimby said, "I had no softness in me, and that softness was what a husband required. There are 4 more names if you would like the rest." Declan Rourke considered this for a moment, standing with one hand resting on the depot railing in the easy, unhurried manner of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that most things worth knowing took longer than a minute to understand. He said, "I would like the rest actually. All 7. But I will tell you before you give them that the first 3 names alone have already told me more about Clifford Pace, Barnaby Wren and Lester Quimby than about you." Willa looked at him steadily for a long moment, searching his face for the thing she had learned over 7 courtships to look for first. The performance of understanding, the careful display of sympathy that preceded, in most men, the gradual arrival of the same objections they had carried in at the outset. She did not find it. What she found instead was something considerably rarer and harder to dismiss. A man who appeared genuinely interested in the rest of what she had to say. She said, "Very well, Mr. Rourke, you asked for all 7. I would suggest you keep walking while I give them, because they take some time to go through properly, and I never saw the point in standing still for a long conversation when forward motion is available." Declan fell into step beside her without another word, the posture of a man prepared to listen, for however long listening was required. To understand why Willa Thorn kept such a precise account of her own refusals, you have to understand what it had meant to grow up the daughter of Phoebe Thorn, the only physician Harwick County had known in 23 years of existence, and, for nearly half that time, the only practicing doctor of any kind within a 2-day ride of the town itself. Phoebe had come to Harwick as a young woman with a medical certificate, earned at considerable personal cost, and had built her practice through the kind of patient, unrelenting competence that made arguments against her qualification progressively more difficult to sustain. She had raised her only daughter inside that practice, and Willa had grown up learning to read anatomical charts before she could read scripture, to identify a fever's source before she could bake a pie, and to speak plainly about physical suffering at an age when most girls, her age, were being taught that such subjects were improper for polite conversation. By the time Willa was 26, she was handling half her mother's caseload on her own. By 30, she was the person half the county sent for first when something went wrong in the night, before the formal appointment with Dr. Thorne could be arranged, and by 34, she had accumulated 7 separate courtships that had each, in turn, begun with apparent interest and ended with some version of the same complaint, that a woman who knew what she knew, and said what she thought, was not the kind of woman a man in Harwick County could comfortably build a life around. She had not kept the list out of bitterness. She had kept it because precision gave her something that a general, accumulated sense of being unwanted never could. A clear view of what exactly had been objected to, and by whom, and under what specific circumstances. That kind of clarity, she had found, was considerably more useful than grief. Declan Rourke's own history had prepared him for this conversation, in ways he would not have been able to predict or explain. He had left Harwick at 22 after a winter that had taken his father and left his older brother in charge of the family's modest operation. A transition that had gone badly enough that Declan had eventually chosen the open range over continued proximity to someone he could not work alongside without incident. He had spent the next 18 years moving between large cattle outfits across Wyoming, Colorado, and Montana, working for men who valued what a hand could do over what he was willing to say about it, and developing along the way a habit of quiet observation that most people mistook for simple reticence. What they missed, in mistaking it for reticence, was that Declan had spent 18 years learning to read situations more carefully than most men bothered to. He had watched foremen blame inexperienced hands for problems those hands had not caused. He had watched ranch owners attribute failed seasons to bad luck that was plainly bad management. He had watched, on more than one occasion, a capable woman on an isolated homestead do work that would have earned a man 3 times the credit, and receive in return the specific variety of invisibility that competence in certain kinds of women seemed reliably to produce in certain kinds of men. He had returned to Harwick the previous spring to claim a modest spread he had been buying piece by piece for a decade. And he had been back long enough to form a general picture of how the town had arranged itself without him. Part of that picture was Willa Thorn. Not in any personal sense, but in the way a small town's persistent conversation about a person eventually reaches everyone within earshot whether they seek it or not. He had heard her described as brilliant, difficult, essential and unmarriageable, often by the same people in the same breath, and had noticed with the kind of attention his years on the range had made habitual, that the people most committed to the last description tended to have a specific interest in keeping it current. Here is the thing neither of them could have seen clearly yet, standing at the edge of Harwick's main road on that October afternoon. Willa Thorn had spent 7 courtships concluding, against her own better judgment, that the qualities she had been raised to consider her greatest strengths might in fact be precisely the qualities that made an ordinary life unavailable to her. And Declan Rourke had spent 18 years quietly looking, without much expectation of finding, for the kind of woman whose intelligence would not have to be managed or apologized for or accommodated like a liability. Neither of them yet understood that the very list Willa was about to recite was the most efficient possible argument for exactly the kind of match neither of them had expected to encounter in Harwick County on an ordinary Thursday. They were 3 blocks from the clinic when Willa began. The first name was Clifford Pace, the eldest son of the man who ran the general store, who had courted Willa for 5 weeks before withdrawing, with the stated reason that a farmer's wife needed to know canning and kitchen management, not the difference between a viral fever and a bacterial one, and that her habit of discussing medical matters at the supper table was more than he could picture tolerating for a lifetime. Declan said, "Clifford Pace has been buying the wrong feed mix for his father's back pasture for 3 years running and has not yet figured out why the yield is off. I know this because his father has mentioned it at the Grange Hall on 4 separate occasions, each time declining to correct Clifford directly, because Clifford does not receive correction well. A man who cannot hear that he is buying the wrong feed will not hear much else that proves inconvenient. I do not think the supper table conversations troubled him, Miss Thorn. I think the possibility of a wife who might eventually notice the feed problem did." Willa had not expected that. She had expected at best a polite expression of sympathy. She kept walking. The second name was Barnaby Wren, a bank clerk who had courted her for nearly 2 months before ending things with what he clearly considered a gentle objection. That no man of standing wanted a wife who greeted his complaints about his health with a clinical assessment rather than wifely concern. And that Willa's habit of accurate diagnosis was, in his words, more unsettling than comforting in a domestic context. Declan said, "Barnaby Wren has been telling anyone who will listen for 2 years that his heart is failing, when what he actually has is a tendency toward excessive coffee and anxiety about his position at the bank, both of which your mother told him plainly, and both of which he has refused to accept because the dramatic version of his condition suits him better socially. A man who prefers an interesting illness to an accurate one will not last long with a woman who can tell the difference. I suspect what truly unsettled him was not your diagnosis, but the quiet recognition that you would not be as manageable as he needed a wife to be." The third name was Lester Quimby, a hardware merchant's nephew who had said, without much delicacy, that Willa lacked the softness required of a wife, that her manner of speaking left a man feeling assessed rather than admired, and that a husband needed to come home to warmth rather than evaluation. Declan said, "Lester Quimby has been engaged once and nearly engaged twice since your courtship, Miss Thorn, and every woman involved has ended it within 3 months. The consistent complaint, as I understand it, is that he requires such constant reassurance that a woman's entire working day could be devoted to providing it and still fall short of sufficient. I think the softness he was looking for was not a temperament. It was a willingness to spend the rest of one's life telling him he was right. I do not find that a reasonable thing to ask of anyone, let alone someone of your particular abilities." Willa found, somewhere around the 4th block, that something in her chest that she had held carefully braced for the better part of 2 years was beginning, with some reluctance, to ease. She had told herself when she offered the list that it would be a mechanical exercise, the warning she gave new suitors as a courtesy, to save them the trouble of discovering her history by accident. She had not expected to feel anything in the telling. She had not expected, in particular, to to feel the specific quality of relief that came from hearing someone examine what she had been carrying, and decline to accept the weight of it as her own. The fourth name was Holden Taft, the son of a church deacon, who had courted her briefly and then withdrawn after an incident at a church social, at which Willa had quietly corrected a factual error he had made about the cause of a neighbor's recent illness. Not to embarrass him, but because the incorrect version had practical consequences for how the congregation was handling the neighbor's contagion. Holden had told her afterward that a wife who corrected her husband in company was an embarrassment no deacon's son could afford. Declan said, "I remember the incident actually. Half the congregation had already decided to avoid the Mercer family based on what Holden said, and the avoidance was doing the Mercers genuine harm by the time your correction reached them. I find it considerably easier to fault a man who placed his own dignity above his congregation's welfare than to fault the woman who noticed the difference. Holden Taft's difficulty was not your correction. It was that you were right in a setting where he expected to be the one whose word held. And he could not reconcile the two things." They had reached the porch of the Thorn Clinic by the time she offered the fifth name, and Willa, rather than ending the conversation at the gate, sat on the front step without quite deciding to. The way a person sits when they are not ready to let a thing be finished. Declan sat beside her without being invited, which she noticed, and which she did not object to. The fifth name, she said, was the one she found most complicated to explain. It was a man named Rufus Beale, a rancher's son from the northern part of the county, who had courted her for nearly 4 months, longer than any of the others, and who had ended the courtship not, as far as Willa had ever been able to determine, because of any objection of his own, but because his widowed mother had declared Willa Thorn unsuitable, and Rufus had found himself unable to hold his position against a sustained campaign of maternal disapproval. Declan was quiet for a long moment after this one. He said, "I knew the Beale family somewhat before I left. A son caught between a woman he values and a mother whose approval he has spent his whole life trying to earn is in a genuinely painful position, and I will not pretend otherwise. I will not say Rufus made the right choice, because I do not think he did. I will say that making the weaker choice from a genuinely difficult position is different from having no difficulty at all with the choice you made. The absence of courage is not always the same as the absence of feeling." Willa said, "That is the first time anyone has said anything but Rufus that was not entirely one thing or entirely the other. I find I appreciate the distinction, even though it costs you nothing to make it." Declan said, "I try to be accurate, even about the people I disagree with. It seems to me that the whole habit of dismissing you entire depends on everyone agreeing not to look too closely at the men doing the dismissing. I find that agreement considerably less persuasive the longer I sit here." The sixth name was the one Willa had told the fewest times, not because it was the most embarrassing but because it required the most explanation to understand properly. His name was Wells Osborne, a traveling supply merchant who had written to her by letter for nearly 8 months, the longest courtship on her list by far. After being introduced by a mutual acquaintance in a neighboring county, the letters had been attentive and specific, asking genuine-seeming questions about her work, her opinions, her ambitions. They had felt for 8 months like the correspondence of a man who was genuinely interested in knowing her. On his third and final visit to Harwick, Wells Osborne had revealed that his interest in Willa had never been in the fullest sense romantic. He had wanted, with a precision that she found almost impressive in its calculation, to convince her to relocate to his county and assist the physician there. A physician who happened to be Wells Osborne's brother-in-law, as an unlicensed aide at a fraction of what her labor was worth. The letters had been a prolonged audition for a position he had not wanted to advertise plainly. He had never been courting her at all. Declan's expression, hearing this, changed in a way that none of the previous 5 had produced in him. He said, "That is a different order of thing entirely, Miss Thorn. The others refused you. This man deceived you for the better part of a year and used your own willingness to be honestly known as the instrument of the deception. I will tell you plainly that I find myself considerably angrier hearing that name than all the others combined, and I think you would be entitled to feel the same." Willa said quietly, "It was the one that took the longest to set down. The others I could understand eventually, even the ones that hurt most. With Wells, there was nothing honest at the bottom of it to finally arrive at. It was simply not real from the first letter, and I did not know that until the last visit." Declan said nothing for a moment. Then, "I am sorry for that one specifically. The rest of the list describes men who were not equal to the task of knowing you. That name describes something smaller and less worth examining." The seventh and final name was the simplest of all. Preston Dunn, a young lawyer newly arrived from the East, had courted Willa for exactly 3 weeks before telling her, with more honesty than she had expected from anyone on the list, that she simply intimidated him, that being in her company made him feel perpetually behind, and that he was not certain he had the constitution for it long term. Declan said, That is at least the truth, and I will give Preston Dunn credit for not dressing it up as something else. I do not think intimidation is a defect in the person who produces it. I think it is information about the distance between who a man is, and who he is willing to be challenged to become. Preston decided that distance was more than he wanted to cross. That tells you something about Preston. It does not tell you anything about whether the crossing would have been worth attempting. They sat together on the clinic porch in the cooling afternoon, and Declan said, 7 names. I have heard all 7 now, and I would like to tell you what I actually heard, because I do not think it has been put to you plainly enough. He said it slowly, in the deliberate way of a man who had spent enough of his life outdoors to know that patience and steadiness accomplished more than haste. Clifford feared you would notice what he could not figure out on his own. Barnaby wanted to be managed in a comfortable fiction, and you would not have managed it. Lester needed more reassurance than a person can honestly provide. Holden could not stand being corrected where others could see it. Rufus made the weaker choice because someone whose approval he needed demanded it. Wells was never honest enough to deserve the conversation at all, and Preston simply flinched. He paused. Not one of those 7 reasons tells me anything true about you, Miss Thorn. Every single one of them describes a specific limitation in the man who gave it. The complete accounting says you have been refused by 7 men who were not prepared for someone of your particular quality. That is not the same thing as something being wrong with you. It is a statement about what has been available in Harwick County, which is a considerably smaller subject than the one you have been carrying around for 2 years. Willa sat on her mother's clinic porch and listened to her own 7 wounds turned over and examined one at a time, and found, without having expected to find anything of the sort, that she could not locate a single point in Declan's accounting with which she honestly disagreed. She said after a long moment, "Why did you ask to walk with me today, Mr. Rourke? You knew some general version of this before you asked. Harwick is not large enough for the story to have missed you entirely." Declan said, "I knew the outline. The particulars, if anything, have settled something I had been uncertain about since I returned in the spring." He was quiet for a moment, in the manner of a man choosing words because he means them rather than because he is constructing an effect. "I watched a good many men over 18 years away use the phrase too much to describe a woman who was simply more than they were willing to be measured against. I heard that phrase applied to you the second week I was back. I found, hearing it said the way it was said, that I had approximately the same opinion of the speaker that I have always had of men who use that phrase that particular way." He looked at her directly then, the look of a man who has decided to stop being careful with a thing and simply say it. "I would like to court you properly, Miss Thorn, with full knowledge of all 7 names, and with no intention of becoming the 8th. Willa Thorn, who had offered the list as a form of protection, a warning she had refined through repetition into something approaching armor, found herself looking at a man who had heard it as an argument in her favor rather than against her, and discovered she did not entirely know what to do with that. She said, "So I accept the courtship, Mr. Rourke, and I will tell you honestly that if you disappoint me in the ways the previous 7 did, you will simply become the 8th entry. And I will examine your particular flaw with the same care I have just heard you extend to theirs." Declan said, "That seems fair. I would not expect anything less from a woman who keeps such careful accounts." They talked on the porch well past the hour when the afternoon light began to leave the street, and Willa found herself speaking about her work, a difficult delivery the previous week, a question she had been corresponding about with a physician in Cheyenne, in the unguarded way she had almost forgotten she was capable of. Declan asked questions that suggested he had been paying actual attention, not the performance of attention she had learned to recognize in men who were waiting for her to finish speaking. Phoebe Thorn, passing through the dispensary window at the back of the clinic, caught a glimpse of her daughter on the front porch, and felt something she recognized, with the precise diagnostic habit of 30 years, as cautious and unhurried hope. Declan Rourke's courtship of Willa Thorn became the subject of considerable comment in Harwick County within a matter of weeks, though the nature of the comment was divided. Those who had always considered Willa unmarriageable found Declan's evident seriousness puzzling. Those who had always privately known better found it long overdue. Clifford Pace encountered Declan at the feed exchange and offered without being asked his view that Willa's manner would prove difficult over time. Declan told him evenly that he had already heard Clifford's particular position on the subject secondhand and had found it considerably less persuasive than Clifford likely intended. Barnaby Wren made a remark at the bank that reached Willa by the following Tuesday. She received it with the same calm she brought to difficult diagnoses, noted it, considered its source, declined to give it more weight than it had earned. The courtship proceeded with a steadiness that none of the previous 7 had managed, and Harwick County, which had long since settled on what it thought about Willa Thorn, began the slow and ungraceful process of revising that opinion. Not because Willa had changed, but because a man whose judgment the county generally respected had made his own judgment visible and public, and it had proven difficult to argue with over time. Declan and Willa were married in the spring, in a small ceremony at the clinic that Phoebe Thorn attended with the particular satisfaction of a woman, watching a long overdue correction arrive at its proper conclusion. Willa kept her accounts as she had warned Declan she would. The ledger after their wedding changed in character entirely. No longer a catalogue of wounds maintained for protection, but a private record of things worth holding. Arguments made honestly and heard fully. Opinions offered into a room where they were not required to shrink before landing. A marriage conducted between two people who had each, in their own way, been waiting without much certainty to find the other. She continued her medical work and eventually earned her own license, after a correspondence course she completed with Declan's full and practical support. Then ran the Harwick County clinic for 31 years after her mother's retirement, treating the children and grandchildren of the same county that had once concluded she was too much for any sensible man to want, and finding, to her considerable satisfaction, that an entire subsequent generation of Harwick's families grew up thinking of her directness, not as a flaw to be accommodated, but simply as the ordinary, reliable manner of the person they sent for, first when something went wrong. Of the 7 men on Willa's original list, 2 said something to her in the years that followed that amounted, if not quite to an apology, then to an acknowledgement. Clifford Pace, whose farm struggled through 3 consecutive difficult seasons before he finally accepted outside advice on the feed problem, told her once at the dry goods store that he had come to understand Declan's position better than he had at the time. He did not say more than that, and Willa did not require him to. Lester Quimby, whose 3rd engagement had dissolved just as the first 2 had, asked her once, with a tentativeness she had never seen in him before, whether she believed a person could change a fundamental habit if they genuinely tried. She told him honestly that she thought most people could change most habits, provided they were willing to be truthful about why the habit had formed in the first place. He thanked her and did not elaborate, and Willa chose to receive it as the closest accounting Lester was likely to manage. Wells Osborne she never heard from again after that final visit to Harwick, which was, as Declan had said the evening she told him, simply correct. There is a thing I have come to believe, having known a few women whose lives contain the particular kind of story that Willa Thorn's did. A list of refusals tells you very little about the person who carries it. It tells you a great deal about the people who contributed to it. Harwick County looked at Willa's list and drew a conclusion about her. Declan Rourke looked at the same list and drew a conclusion about the town. The difference in what each of them saw was not in the list itself. It was in who was willing to read it the right way around. I would like to leave you with one question before you go. Of the 7 men on Willa's list, which one do you think revealed the most about his own character and the reason he gave? I would genuinely like to know what you think. Leave your answer in the comments below. And if you want another story about a woman whose worth took longer than it should have for the right person to recognize, the next one is already waiting for you.